They handed him a graveyard with thrusters, a flying coffin. The instructors at the Coalition Academy didn't just want Cadet Ford to fail his final exam. They wanted him to disappear. They gave him a busted cruiser that hadn't seen the stars in 40 years, laughed, and pointed him toward the most dangerous sector in the galaxy. They expected silence. What they got was a distress signal, a localized gravity anomaly, and Ford returning with a whole damn armada on his tail. The hangar smelled like burnt hair and ozone. It was a stagnant, bitter scent that clung to the back of the throat. Cadet Caleb Ford stood at the bottom of the launch ramp, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The bag held 3 changes of clothes, a mess kit, and a heavy iron wrench. He figured he'd need the wrench more than the clothes. Before him sat the Providence. Calling it a ship was generous. It was a hulking mass of scarred titanium and exposed wiring, a brutalist relic from a war everyone else had agreed to forget. The port-side hull was blackened from atmospheric burns. The starboard engine cowling was completely missing, exposing the intricate, rusted guts of the thrust vectoring assembly. It looked like a scavenged corpse. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Ford didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Instructor Briggs had a way of speaking that sounded like he was constantly chewing on grit. "She's a scrap heap, Briggs," Ford said, his voice flat. He let his eyes trace the jagged weld lines holding the primary airlock together. "You're sending me out in a donor frame." Briggs stepped up beside him. He was a tall, immaculate man. His uniform was pressed so sharply the creases could cut glass. He smelled of synthetic pine and expensive cologne. The contrast between him and the decaying ship was almost comical. "I'm sending you on your final practical assessment, Cadet," Briggs corrected, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Every prospective officer must command a vessel through the outer rim patrols. It tests resourcefulness, independence, leadership. There is no crew," Ford pointed out. "Then you will lead yourself." Briggs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "The Academy assigns vessels based on merit, Ford. The upper echelons earned the newer interceptors. You are a special case. You humans always are. Late to the Coalition. Slow to adapt. We had to find something that fit your particular aptitude." Ford adjusted the strap of his bag. His knuckles were white. He knew the game. Earth was a backwater, a muddy rock that had only recently scratched its way out of its own atmosphere. The Coalition tolerated humans because they needed manual labor and shock troops. They didn't want them commanding ships. They certainly didn't want a kid from the Boston Sprawl wearing an officer's pin. "Where are the reactor logs?" Ford asked. Briggs tapped a data pad against his thigh. "Lost in the archives. Don't worry, engineering assures me she has enough juice for a slip jump to Sector 4 and back." "Sector 4 is a dead zone. It's a designated patrol route." Briggs shoved the data pad into Ford's chest. Ford caught it before it hit the deck. "Log your departure by Oro 600. If you aren't back in 3 days, we list you as MIA. Good luck, Cadet." Briggs turned and walked away, the sharp click of his boots echoing off the grease-stained floor. Ford watched him go. He didn't feel anger. Anger was a luxury for people who had a safety net. Ford just felt tired, a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. He walked up the ramp. The airlock hissed, struggling to separate the seals. Ford had to put his shoulder into the heavy metal door, shoving it aside with a grunt. The interior was freezing. The life support was technically on, but the air was stale, tasting of rust and old sweat. The emergency lights flickered, casting sickly yellow shadows across the bulkheads. He dropped his bag in the narrow corridor. Wires hung from the ceiling like mechanical vines. The floor plating was warped. Ford made his way to the bridge. It was smaller than he expected. Two cramped consoles flanked a cracked primary viewport. The command chair was missing most of its padding, exposing yellow, crumbling foam. He sat down. The chair groaned in protest. He powered up the main console. The screen flared, blinded him with static for 3 seconds, and then resolved into a messy diagnostic overlay. Red warnings cascaded down the right side of the screen. Warning, life support running at 40% efficiency. Warning, primary comms array disconnected. Warning, thermal shielding integrity compromised. Warning, coolant leak detected in aft thruster. Ford leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Right, he muttered to himself in the empty ship. Resourcefulness. He spent the next 4 hours ripping panels off the walls. He didn't bother calling for a mechanic. Briggs had made sure the engineering bays were completely cleared of personnel. It was just Ford, the Providence, and a creeping cold that settled deep in his joints. He used heavy-duty electrical tape to bind the severed comms cables. He rerouted the coolant flow manually, bypassing the leaking valve by cannibalizing a pipe from the officer's washroom. It meant he couldn't flush the toilet without flooding the corridor, but it kept the thruster from melting down. Priorities. By the time he strapped back into the command chair, his hands were covered in black grease and his breath plumed in the freezing air of the cabin. He bypassed the pre-flight checks. If he ran them, the ship's onboard computer would lock him out and refuse to launch. He gripped the throttle. It felt cold and heavy in his hand. Control. This is Cadet Ford, Vessel Providence. He keyed the short-range radio. Requesting launch clearance. Static hissed back at him. Then a bored voice. Clearance granted, Providence. Don't scratch the paint on your way out. Ford ignited the sublight engines. The ship didn't hum. It screamed. A violent, rattling vibration tore through the hull, shaking the deck plate so hard Ford's teeth clicked together. The structural groan was deafening. Dust rained down from the ceiling vents. For 10 agonizing seconds, the Providence fought against the launch clamps, trembling like a dying animal. Then the clamps released. The cruiser threw itself forward. The acceleration compensators were shot, and the G-force slammed into Ford's chest like a sledgehammer. He couldn't breathe. His vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into black. He held the throttle steady, his fingers locked in a death grip, praying the hull wouldn't shear apart in the atmosphere. The sky outside the cracked viewport faded from harsh blue to a deep, bruised purple, and finally, to the endless, absolute black of the void. The rattling subsided to a dull, throbbing ache in the bulkheads. Ford gasped for air, his chest heaving. He wiped a streak of blood from his nose. He looked at the sensor readouts. The engine was burning hot, but holding. He was in space. "All right, you ugly piece of junk," Ford whispered, patting the console. "Let's go see the dead zone." Deep space wasn't an ocean. That was a poet's lie. It was a freezer. 14 hours out from the academy, the Providence was barely holding together. The internal heating had failed completely in the aft section. Ford had dragged his mattress into the cockpit and sealed the blast doors to keep the remaining warmth trapped in a 10 by 10 space. He was wearing 2 thermal shirts, his standard issue jacket, and a beanie he had scavenged from a forgotten locker. He sat in the dark, watching the chronometer tick down. Slipspace jumps were supposed to be smooth. A tear in reality, a smooth glide through the folded dimensions, and a gentle pop back into real space. The Providence's jump drive felt like being dragged over a gravel road behind a speeding truck. Every hour in the slipstream, the ship screamed. Ford didn't sleep. He couldn't. He watched the jump drive diagnostics. The containment field was fluctuating wildly. The containment housing, theoretically rated for thousands of jumps, had micro-fractures. It was bleeding trace amounts of radiation into the secondary hull. "Just hold together," Ford muttered, wrapping his hands around a mug of lukewarm synthetic coffee. "Just get me to Sector 4. Let me ping the beacon and we can limp home." Sector 4 was an anomaly. It was a vast stretch of empty space on the fringes of Coalition territory, devoid of habitable planets, valuable minerals, or strategic choke points. It was a cosmic wasteland filled with drifting rock and sensor-blinding dust clouds. The Academy used it as a dumping ground for cadets they wanted to punish. Go to the empty space, sit there for a day, write a report on nothing, and come back. A sudden sharp klaxon shattered the silence. Ford spilled the coffee on his lap, cursing as the lukewarm liquid soaked into his trousers. He slammed his hand on the console, killing the alarm. Proximity warning. Mass shadow detected. Ford frowned. He wiped the screen with his sleeve. That was impossible. They were still in the slipstream. You couldn't detect mass shadows in slipspace unless something incredibly dense was generating a localized gravity well. He checked his coordinates. He was 10 minutes away from the dropout point in Sector 4. "Computer, filter out background static. Give me a raw sensor sweep of the dropout coordinates." The screen flickered, struggling to process the command. Slow, jagged lines drew themselves across the display. Ford leaned in, his breath fogging the glass. There was a massive gravitational displacement ahead. Not a planet. Planets didn't move. The anomaly was shifting. It was a cluster of dense objects. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Ford felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Coalition fleet was currently docked 3 sectors away for standard resupply. The nearest trade lanes were weeks off course. There was absolutely no reason for anything to be in Sector 4. "Kill the drive," Ford ordered himself. He reached for the manual override. "Drop out early." He grabbed the heavy red lever on the console and yanked it backward. The Providence bucked wildly. The slip drive whined in protest, a high-pitched screech that made Ford's ears bleed. Sparks showered from the ceiling overhead. The ship violently tore itself out of the slipstream, tumbling end over end into real space. Ford was thrown against his restraints, his ribs groaning against the straps. Outside the viewport, the stars spun in a nauseating blur. He fought the manual thrusters, firing short bursts of maneuvering gas to stabilize the spin. It took 3 agonizing minutes to bring the heavy, dead weight of the cruiser to a halt. When the stars finally stopped spinning, Ford slumped back in the chair, gasping. He had dropped out early. He was on the very edge of Sector 4, hidden within a dense soup of cosmic dust and localized asteroid debris. He killed all active systems. He shut down the primary reactor, the sublight engines, and the active sensors. He switched to emergency battery power. The only thing running was passive optics and life support on its lowest setting. The ship went completely dark, a silent chunk of dead metal drifting among the rocks. Ford stared out the viewport. At first, he saw nothing but dust and distant stars. Then, the dust parted. His breath hitched in his throat. They were massive, sleek, angular dreadnoughts painted in a matte, light-absorbing black. They didn't look like coalition ships. Coalition ships were bulky, designed for utility and endurance. These ships were built like daggers. They bristled with weapon emplacements that Ford didn't even recognize. There weren't just a few of them. There was a fleet. Cruisers, frigates, massive carriers launching swarms of angular fighter craft. They were sitting in absolute silence, running dark, staging themselves in the blind spot of the coalition's borders. Ford pulled up the tactical database on his datapad, typing frantically in the dark. He cross-referenced the hull designs. Nothing. No match in the coalition archives. No match in the fringe syndicates. These were unknown, and they were pointing straight at the inner colonies. "They're staging an invasion," Ford whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The coalition was totally blind. The main fleet was docked. The perimeter sensors in Sector 4 were notoriously faulty, easily spoofed by anyone who knew how to jam the older frequencies. Ford looked at his ship, the Providence, a flying coffin missing half its armor. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't even run. His slip drive needed 20 minutes to spin up, and the moment he ignited the reactor, his thermal signature would light up on their scanners like a supernova. They would vaporize him before he finished typing in the jump coordinates. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He thought about Briggs. He thought about the academy and the clean, polished halls where they sneered at the dirt under his fingernails. He could just sit here. He could power down life support, freeze to death in his sleep, and let the coalition burn. They had sent him here to die anyway. But Ford remembered the sprawling slums of Earth. He remembered his brother working the atmospheric processors in the Boston ruins. He remembered a billion people who didn't have starships or polished boots, who would burn first when this fleet crossed the border. Ford clenched his fists. The shaking stopped. "All right," Ford said to the empty, freezing bridge. "You want a final exam? Let's take the exam." Ford unbuckled his harness and floated out of the command chair. With gravity plating powered down to save juice, moving through the ship was a matter of pushing off bulkheads and gliding through the narrow corridors. He needed to think. He couldn't fight. He couldn't jump. But he needed to warn the academy. He made his way to engineering, navigating by the dim red glow of emergency battery strips. The air down here was thick with the smell of leaking coolant and scorched wire. He floated toward the primary reactor housing. It was a massive, scarred cylinder of depleted uranium and lead shielding. The warning lights on the casing were blinking a steady, angry amber. Microfractures in containment. Ford stared at the reactor. An idea formed in his mind. It was a terrible idea. It was the kind of idea that got you court-martialed, assuming it didn't vaporize you first. The Providence was dead, but its reactor was a military-grade power plant designed for a warship twice this size. It was old, unstable, and leaking. If he removed the dampeners, the reactor would start a runaway thermal chain reaction. It would overheat in minutes. To the alien fleet out there, a spiking reactor wouldn't look like a dead frigate. It would look like a massive capital-class dreadnought charging its primary weapons. He could use the ship as a decoy, but there was a catch. If he removed the dampeners, the radiation shielding would fail entirely. The cockpit would be flooded with lethal doses of gamma radiation within 15 minutes. Ford didn't hesitate. He pulled the heavy iron wrench from his belt. He wedged the wrench into the release latch of the primary dampener rod. He had to brace his boots against the deck plating and pull with all his strength. The metal groaned, rusted tight from decades of neglect. Ford strained, his muscles burning, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing air. With a sharp crack, the latch broke. The dampener rod slid out with a hiss of pressurized gas. Instantly, the amber lights on the reactor turned a furious, flashing red. A deep, resonant thrum began to echo through the deck plates, a vibration that Ford felt in his teeth. He didn't stop. He pushed off the wall and flew back down the corridor, pulling himself along the exposed wiring hand over hand. He threw himself into the cockpit and strapped back into the command chair. "Computer, status!" he yelled. The screen flared to life, no longer starved for power. The reactor output was climbing exponentially. 110%, 150%, 200%. "Warning, thermal overload imminent," the computer chimed, its synthesized voice eerily calm. "Radiation levels in the cabin exceeding safe limits. Recommend immediate evacuation." Ford ignored it. He opened a channel on the primary comms array, broadcasting on an open, unencrypted frequency. He maximized the signal strength, routing all the excess power from the spiking reactor directly into the broadcast dish. He didn't send a message. He sent raw, screaming feedback. He sent a digital roar that would deafen every sensor suite within 1,000,000 miles. Out in the void, the alien fleet reacted instantly. Ford watched the passive optics. The massive black dreadnoughts, previously dormant, suddenly lit up. Thousands of thrusters ignited like angry blue fireflies. Their formations broke, heavy cruisers banking hard to face the source of the noise. They were looking right at the dust cloud. They were looking right at a thermal signature that suggested a coalition juggernaut was sitting in the dark, screaming at them. "Come on," Ford whispered, his fingers flying across the navigation console. He wasn't plotting a course home. He was plotting a micro jump. He needed them to follow him. The alien fleet began to advance. Torpedo bays opened. Targeting lasers, invisible to the naked eye but blinding on Ford's sensors, swept across the debris field. The temperature in the cabin was rising rapidly. The frost on the viewport began to melt, turning into beads of water that floated in the zero gravity. Ford could feel a prickling sensation on his skin, the invisible fire of radiation seeping through the bulkheads. He tasted copper in the back of his mouth. "Radiation levels critical," the computer warned. "Shut up," Ford grunted. He locked in the coordinates. The lead alien dreadnought fired. A lance of pure, blinding white energy tore through the void, vaporizing an asteroid a mile off Ford's port side. The shockwave rattled the Providence, throwing Ford hard against his straps. He slammed his hand on the jump lever. "Spin up!" The slip drive, flooded with triple its normal operating power from the runaway reactor, didn't whine. It shrieked. The fabric of space tore open violently. Just as a second lance of white energy lanced toward his cockpit, the Providence plunged into the slipstream. The transition was brutal. The ship was literally tearing itself apart. Bulkheads buckled. The aft section lost atmospheric pressure, venting oxygen into the slipstream in a violent plume. Ford gripped the armrests, blood dripping from his nose, his vision swimming. He wasn't jumping back to the academy. Not yet. He dropped out of the jump just 2 sectors over. He slammed the brakes, letting the ship drift. He left the reactor screaming, left the comms array blaring its deafening static. He waited. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The space behind him tore open. 4 alien cruisers burst into real space, their sensors locked onto his massive thermal decoy. They had taken the bait. They were hunting the phantom juggernaut. Ford smiled, a bloody, exhausted grimace. Gotcha. He punched the jump lever again. He was going to drag them, 1 micro jump at a time. He was going to lead this entire execution squad right to Instructor Briggs' polished front door. The Providence was dying. Ford could hear it in the way the bulkheads groaned, a deep structural agony that reverberated through the soles of his boots. He punched the jump lever again. Space tore open. The battered cruiser hurled itself into the dimensional fold, the slip drive screaming like a tortured animal. Ford gripped the armrests so hard his knuckles ached. His vision blurred, the edges turning a fuzzy, static-filled gray. The heat in the cockpit was suffocating. The environmental controls had completely flatlined 2 jumps ago. The runaway reactor, still bleeding its excess power into the comms array and the engines, was baking the ship from the inside out. Ford stripped off his jacket and his outer thermal shirt, tossing them onto the deck where they instantly soaked up a puddle of leaking hydraulic fluid. He was sweating profusely, but his skin felt dry and tight, like it was stretched over a radiator. He recognized the symptoms. Standard Academy medical briefing, week 4, acute radiation exposure. The metallic taste of copper coated his tongue. He spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the console. 3 minutes, he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves being crushed. Just give me 3 more minutes. The ship violently snapped back into real space. Sector 2, Grid Alpha. Ford didn't bother checking his coordinates. He immediately slammed the thrusters, throwing the Providence into a harsh barrel roll to avoid the debris field he knew occupied this sector. Dust and micrometeors peppered the hull, sounding like hail on a tin roof. He stared at the rear sensor display. 10 seconds ticked by. 15. Tear. The void behind him ripped open. 4 sleek, light-absorbing dreadnoughts poured into real space. They were relentless. They didn't move like coalition ships, which relied on lumbering, calculated thrust vectors. These black ships moved with a terrifying, predatory fluidity. They banked in perfect unison, their targeting lasers painting the Providence's thermal signature instantly. They were getting faster. During the first jump, it took them nearly a minute to calculate his trajectory and follow. Now they were on him in seconds. They were learning the ancient, jury-rigged mechanics of his jump drive. A proximity alarm shrieked. Missile lock detected. Not today, Ford grunted. He diverted all remaining auxiliary power from the primary stabilizers to the slip drive. The ship lurched wildly, drifting sideways as the artificial gravity completely failed. Dust, loose screws, and droplets of Ford's blood lifted into the air, floating in chaotic orbits around the cabin. The lead dreadnought fired. 2 silent, brilliant streaks of purple plasma ignited the darkness, hurtling toward the Providence. Ford grabbed the heavy iron wrench from the floor, floating weightless beside his knee. The jump lever's locking mechanism had fused from the heat 2 systems ago. He had to manually break the safety catch every time he initiated a sequence. He swung the wrench, smashing it into the console housing. Sparks showered over his face, burning his cheek. He yanked the exposed cabling, forcing the drive to engage. The plasma torpedoes were less than a mile away when space folded around the Providence. The explosive shock wave clipped his aft shielding as the ship vanished, sending a violent, concussive wave through the hull. In the slipstream, the ship spun out of control. Ford vomited, a dry, painful heave that yielded nothing but yellow bile. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand. He pulled up the navigation chart on his datapad. The screen was cracked, the tactical overlay flickering. One jump left. Sector 1, the heart of Coalition space, the Academy. He looked at the reactor diagnostic. The core temperature was at 280% of its maximum safe operating threshold. The containment shielding was a memory. The control rods were warped beyond use. The Providence wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a ticking, dirty bomb, held together by sheer forward momentum and Ford's refusal to die quietly. "Computer!" Ford wheezed, his lungs burning with every breath. "Set auto-eject for the primary reactor core upon real space deceleration. 5-second delay. Command recognized. Warning: core ejection will leave the vessel without primary power. Life support will fail. Maneuvering thrusters will fail." "Do it," Ford ordered. He didn't plan on needing thrusters. He planned on dropping a nuclear anvil right on the Academy's front porch. He braced his boots against the main console, tying himself to the command chair with a length of severed comms wire. He stared out the cracked viewport into the swirling violent colors of the slipstream. "All right, Briggs," Ford whispered, closing his eyes. "Here's my final report." Instructor Briggs stood in the primary observation deck of the Coalition Academy, holding a cup of imported kava tea. He liked the observation deck. It offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the orbital docking rings, where the pristine silver frigates of the Academy Defense Fleet hung in perfect, geometric formations. It was an image of order, of control. "Cadet roster for the incoming cycle is looking thin, Briggs," Commander Reed said, stepping up to the reinforced glass beside him. Reed was a stout man with a graying beard and a perpetual scowl. "Command wants us to loosen the physical requirements. Again." "Unacceptable," Briggs replied, taking a slow sip of his tea. "The moment we lower the standard, we invite the rot. Look at the current graduating class. We are forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel just to meet deployment quotas." "You mean Ford?" Briggs smiled, a thin, cruel line. "I mean the human, yes, though I don't expect we'll have to worry about grading his final practical. He was sent to Sector 4 in the Providence." Reed raised an eyebrow. "The Providence? I thought engineering decommissioned that scrap heap last year. The reactor is unstable." "It passed the bare minimum safety checks," Briggs lied smoothly. "If the cadet cannot navigate basics mechanical failures, he has no place in a Coalition uniform. It's a harsh galaxy, Commander. The weak are filtered out." Before Reed could respond, a low, pulsing klaxon echoed through the observation deck. The ambient lighting immediately shifted from a soft white to a harsh, tactical red. The massive holographic display table in the center of the room sprang to life, projecting a three-dimensional map of the surrounding space. "What is that?" Reed barked, spilling his coffee as he hurried to the console. "Proximity alert!" a young technician shouted from the lower pit, his fingers dancing frantically across his keyboard. Massive spatial displacement detected on the perimeter edge of Sector 1. Sire, something is forcing a slip space exit dead ahead. Briggs frowned, setting his tea down. Identity? Is it the main fleet returning early? Negative, sir. The thermal signature it's completely erratic. It's registering as a capital-class dreadnought, but the telemetry is chaotic. Sir, it's coming in too hot. It's not decelerating. Raise the orbital defense shields, Reed ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Scramble Intercept Squadron Alpha. Outside the viewport, the serene blackness of space violently tore open. Briggs staggered back as a blinding flash of blue light illuminated the entire orbital ring. It wasn't a dreadnought. Tumbling out of the slipstream, trailing a massive comet tail of fire, vented oxygen, and debris, was a ship. It was spinning end over end, completely out of control, hurling directly toward the Academy's primary docking bay. The port side of the hull was peeled back like a tin can, exposing the ribs of the internal superstructure. "Good God," Reed whispered. "Identify that vessel." "Transponder code is heavily scrambled," the technician yelled over the blaring alarms. "Wait, matching registry. Sir, it's the Providence." Briggs felt the blood drain from his face. Impossible. He was sent to Sector 4. How did he jump back with that drive? "Sir, the reactor is critical. It's going to breach before impact." Out in the void, the flaming wreck of the Providence suddenly heaved. A massive glowing cylinder, the primary reactor core, was violently ejected from the ship's underbelly. The core drifted for exactly 5 seconds. Then, it detonated. The explosion was a silent, blinding sun erupting in the vacuum of space. The concussive wave of the nuclear blast hit the Academy's orbital shields, shaking the massive station to its core. Briggs was thrown to the deck, his ears ringing as the reinforced glass of the observation window groaned under the kinetic stress. The electromagnetic pulse from the detonation scrambled the station's sensors, filling the holographic display with blinding static. "Report!" Reed bellowed, pulling himself up by the edge of the tactical table. "Shield status!" "Shields holding at 60%, the technician coughed, fighting through the sparks raining down from his console. "The EMP blinded our long-range scanners. The Providence used the blast to decelerate. It's coasting." Briggs scrambled to his feet, staring out the window. The Providence hadn't been destroyed. The shockwave of the ejected core had acted as a brutal, improvised brake, arresting the ship's forward momentum just enough. The burning dead husk of the cruiser slammed into the external armor of Docking Bay 4, tearing through the outer gantry and wedging itself deep into the station's superstructure. Metal shrieked. Debris rained down on the lower levels. Then, silence. Briggs breathed heavily. He stared at the wreckage. The human had survived. He had somehow dragged that flying coffin back from the edge of the galaxy and crashed it into his pristine station. "Dispatch security and medical teams to Bay 4, Reed ordered, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "I want that cadet in irons the second they pull him out of there." "Wait," the technician said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The static on the holographic table was beginning to clear. The EMP interference faded, allowing the short-range sensors to re-establish their feed. "Sir," the technician swallowed hard. "The spatial displacement alarm. It wasn't just the Providence. The slipstream tear hasn't closed." Briggs turned slowly back to the window. Beyond the burning wreckage of Cadet Ford's ship, the void of space was tearing open again. Not once, not twice. Dozens of ruptures appeared. From the jagged edges of folded space, the black fleet emerged. They glided out of the darkness in absolute silence. Massive, angular silhouettes that drank the ambient light of the stars. Cruisers, destroyers, a pair of colossal carriers that dwarfed the Academy's defense frigates. They fanned out, forming a blockade formation that entirely surrounded the orbital station. "What are those?" Reed breathed, all the authority draining from his voice. Briggs couldn't speak. He stared at the alien armada, his pristine view of order completely shattered. They hadn't detected a thing. The entire coalition perimeter had been breached, and they wouldn't have known until these ships started firing on the inner colonies. The cadet hadn't run away. He hadn't failed his navigation exam. He had lured them out of the shadows. "Sir," the technician's voice was frantic. "They're locking weapons, all of them. They're targeting the station." Docking Bay 4 was a disaster zone. The heavy blast doors had sealed the moment the Providence breached the outer hull, but the entire section was filled with smoke, screaming venting systems, and the harsh strobe of emergency lights. A squad of Academy security officers, clad in heavy riot armor, rushed down the corridor. Briggs was right behind them, coughing into his sleeve, a heavy plasma pistol drawn and gripped tightly in his sweating hand. "Breach it!" the squad leader barked, pointing to the crumpled airlock of the Providence, which was now fused with the station's internal bulkhead. Two officers stepped forward with heavy plasma cutters, engaging the blue-white blades and slicing into the twisted titanium. Sparks rained down on the deck. The station shook violently. Another muffled explosion echoed through the floorboards. "The defense fleet is engaging," Briggs muttered, glancing at the comms unit on his wrist. The channel was a chaotic mess of screaming pilots and dying ships. The alien fleet, whoever they were, was systematically tearing the coalition frigates apart. Their weaponry ignored standard energy shields, burning right through the armor plating. "We need the cadet," Briggs said, pushing past the squad leader. "If he engaged them, he might have telemetry data. We need to know what we're fighting." "Hull breached," an officer shouted. He kicked the heavy metal plate inward. It fell with a dull clang into the dark, smoke-filled corridor of the ship. "Cadet Ford, stand down and identify," the squad leader yelled, sweeping the darkness with the mounted light on his rifle. Nothing but the hiss of escaping gas answered him. Briggs pushed past the security team, stepping through the jagged hole in the hull. The interior of the Providence was a graveyard. The temperature was freezing, the air thin and tasting of heavy metals and burnt plastic. "Spread out, find him," Briggs ordered. He walked down the main corridor toward the bridge. Gravity was gone, replaced by the weak, artificial pull of the station's dampeners bleeding through the hull. He reached the blast doors of the cockpit. They were warped, the locking mechanism melted solid. Briggs aimed his pistol at the seam and fired 3 high-yield blasts, blowing the hinges apart. He kicked the door open. The bridge was a tomb. The consoles were blackened, melted slag. The viewport was shattered, emergency blast shutters barely holding the vacuum of space at bay. Sitting in the command chair, tied down by thick cables, was Ford. He looked dead. His uniform was soaked in blood and black hydraulic fluid. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, the skin around his cheekbones heavily blistered from radiation burns. His head hung forward, chin resting on his chest. Briggs lowered his pistol. He felt a strange, cold knot of dread in his stomach. He stepped over the floating debris, reaching out to check the cadet's pulse. Before his fingers touched Ford's neck, the cadet's hand snapped up. Ford's grip was surprisingly strong. He locked his fingers around Briggs's wrist, holding it tight. Slowly, painfully, Ford lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites completely red from burst capillaries. He was breathing in shallow, wet rasps. You missed the deadline, Briggs," Ford whispered. He coughed, a terrible rattling sound, and blood trickled down his chin. "Ford, the ship's outside," Briggs demanded, trying to pull his arm away, but finding the human's grip unyielding. "What are they? Where did you find them?" "Sector 4. Ford let go of Briggs's wrist and tapped a heavy, blood-stained datapad resting on his lap. "They were staging in the dust clouds, running dark. Your perimeter is a joke. Did you map their weapon signatures? Do you have tactical telemetry?" Ford slowly unbuckled the heavy wires holding him in the chair. He pushed himself up. His legs gave out immediately, and he collapsed against the melted console, using it to keep himself upright. "I have everything," Ford gasped. "Shield frequencies, thrust vectors, hull densities. I spent 3 hours dragging them across the rim, letting them shoot at me while the computer recorded every damn variable." Briggs stared at him. The human was dying. The dosimeter on Briggs's uniform was already ticking wildly, warning of the residual radiation saturating the cabin. Ford had absorbed a lethal dose, and he had done it intentionally to keep the ship moving. "Give me the datapad," Briggs said, extending a hand. "I need to get this to command. We have to adapt the defense grid." Ford looked at the datapad, then up at Briggs. A slow, cynical smile cracked his blistered lips. "No," Briggs blinked. "What?" "Cadet, this is a direct order. The Academy is under attack. The inner colonies are exposed. Hand over the intel." "You sent me out here in a coffin," Ford said, his voice gaining a fraction of its old strength. "You wanted me to disappear so your pristine little academy could pretend the galaxy is clean. Well, it's not clean, Briggs. It's dirty. And right now, the only thing standing between you and those black ships is a kid from the dirt." The station shook again, a massive concussive blow that threw Briggs against the bulkhead. The emergency lights flickered and died, leaving them bathed in the red glow of the security team's flashlights in the hall. "What do you want, Ford?" Briggs shouted over the noise of grinding metal. "You want a medal? You want a commission?" "I want the fleet," Ford said softly. "You're out of your mind. You're a cadet. You're half dead." "I'm the only one who knows how they move," Ford countered, gripping the datapad tightly. "I watched them. They don't fight like you. They don't care about formations. They hunt. If you send Reed and his textbook admirals out there, they'll be ash in 10 minutes. Ford pushed off the console, stumbling forward. Briggs caught him by the shoulder, keeping him from collapsing entirely. "Take me to the tactical bay," Ford demanded, coughing violently onto Briggs's immaculate uniform. "You plug this datapad in, and you give me a live feed to the defense fleet. You let me coordinate the strike." "That is a violation of every military protocol in the Coalition Charter," Briggs said. "Then die," Ford replied coldly. "Let them glass the station. Because I swear to God, Briggs, I will format this drive right now before I hand it to a man who hides behind a desk." Briggs looked into the human's eyes. There was no bluff. There was only the cold, hard stare of someone who had already accepted his own death and was entirely willing to take the rest of them with him if they didn't play by his rules. "Sir," the squad leader yelled from the corridor, "the outer defense ring just collapsed. They're moving on the primary habitation modules." Briggs swallowed hard. He looked at his pristine uniform, now stained with human blood and engine grease. He looked at the dying cadet holding the key to their survival. "Get him up," Briggs barked at the security team, grabbing Ford by his other arm and hoisting him upright. "Medic, give him a stim shot. Pack him with whatever painkillers you have. We are moving to the command center." They dragged Ford out of the ruined airlock. As they pulled him down the hallway, the cadet clutched the datapad to his chest. The academy was burning. The pristine halls were filled with smoke, the arrogant order shattered by the brutal reality of the void. And at the center of the chaos, bleeding and irradiated, a human was leading them to war. The primary command center of the Coalition Academy was a cathedral of arrogance. Vaulted ceilings, pristine white consoles, and a massive, spherical holographic projection of the local sector dominated the room. Usually, it was quiet, filled with the soft murmurs of tacticians analyzing hypothetical war games. Right now, it was a slaughterhouse of information. Red warnings bled across every screen. The spherical projection was a mess of hostile black markers, systematically erasing the silver dots of the Coalition defense fleet. Commander Reed was shouting at a comms officer, his face purple, spit flying from his lips. "Tell the 7th Flotilla to form a phalanx grid," Reed bellowed, slamming his fist on the tactical table. "Overlapping shields. We have to weather their barrage before returning fire." "They can't, sir," the comms officer screamed back, hands flying over his console. "The enemy weapons. They're bypassing the shields entirely. It's like the energy barriers aren't even there. The 7th is gone, Commander. They just vaporized the flagship." The heavy blast doors hissed open. Briggs strode in. His pristine uniform was ruined, soaked in black grease and human blood. He was practically carrying Cadet Ford. The human looked like a corpse dragged from a wreck. His skin was gray, covered in nasty weeping radiation burns. A medic flanked them, holding a localized IV line that was pumping a steady stream of heavy synthetic adrenaline directly into Ford's neck. The command room fell completely silent for 2 seconds. Even the klaxons seemed to dull. "Briggs?" Reed stared, completely bewildered. "What is the meaning of this? Why is there a dying cadet in my war room?" "He brought them," Briggs said, his voice hard. He didn't look at Reed. He looked at the tactical sphere. "He found the staging ground in Sector 4. They were running dark. He dragged them here to warn us." "Warn us?" Reed snapped, finding his outrage. "He led an invasion force directly to the academy. Arrest him, throw him in the brig, and get back to your station, instructor." Ford didn't wait for Briggs to argue. The human pulled himself away from Briggs's grip. He stumbled forward. Every step was an agony, a violent shudder of a body that was actively dying at the cellular level. He reached the central tactical table and slammed the heavy blood-stained datapad onto the glass surface. "Connect it," Ford rasped. His voice was a wet, heavy scrape. "Security!" Reed yelled. Briggs drew his plasma pistol and slammed it onto the console beside the datapad. The loud metallic crack echoed through the room. "Connect the damn drive, Reed," Briggs snarled, looking his superior officer dead in the eye. "Our fleet is dying because you're fighting by a rule book these aliens haven't read. The human has their telemetry. He has their weapon signatures." Reed looked at the gun. He looked at Briggs's cold eyes. He nodded tightly to the tech beside him. The technician grabbed the cable and plugged Ford's datapad into the mainframe. Instantly, the holographic sphere stuttered. The generic red markers representing the enemy fleet resolved into highly detailed, sharply angled ship schematics. Streams of green data cascaded down the secondary screens. Ford leaned heavily on the console, coughing into his sleeve. When he pulled his arm away, the fabric was stained dark red. "They don't use kinetic impactors," Ford wheezed, staring at the data he had paid for with his life. "Their weapons are thermal resonance beams. They agitate the molecules in our armor. Overlapping your shields is just giving them a massive stationary battery to lock onto. You're lighting yourselves up like beacons." "What are you saying?" Reed demanded. "I'm saying drop the shields," Ford commanded. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the tactical officers. "Drop the shields on every surviving ship. Now." "That's suicide," Reed argued. "Without shields, a single micrometeor could punch through a hull." "With shields, they're getting melted into slag," Ford shot back, a sudden surge of adrenaline fueling his voice. "Do it. Cut the shields. Route all auxiliary power to the primary maneuvering thrusters and the kinetic railguns." Briggs looked at the comms officer. "Issue the order. Flotilla-wide override. Authorization Briggs 7 Alpha." The officer hesitated, then typed frantically. In the holographic sphere, the glowing blue halos around the surviving coalition ships flickered and died. They were entirely naked, bare metal exposed to the void. "They're blind now," Ford said, gripping the edge of the table. "They track energy spikes. When you drop the shields, your thermal footprint shrinks by 80%. They're predators. They hunt the loudest, brightest things in the dark." On the projection, the alien dreadnoughts paused. Their tight, sweeping formations stuttered. Without the massive energy signatures of the coalition shields to guide their automated targeting arrays, their beams sliced harmlessly through empty space, missing the dark hulls of the frigates by miles. "It worked," the technician whispered in disbelief. "They lost target lock." Ford didn't smile. There was no time. "They won't stay blind for long. They have passive optics. But we just bought the fleet their legs back. Now we teach them how to brawl." He pointed a shaking, blistered finger at the projection. "Tell the heavy cruisers to vent their primary coolant reserves into space. All of it. Create a thermal smoke screen." "They'll overheat in 10 minutes, Reed protested, though his voice lacked its previous authority. "Then we end this in 9, Ford said coldly. "Do it. Vent the coolant. Tell the destroyers to hide in the vapor clouds. Stop fighting in lines. Stop fighting like gentlemen. Break formation. Tell them to get in close and use the railguns at point-blank range. Rip their guts out." Briggs watched the human. Ford wasn't a cadet anymore. He was a street fighter from Earth, backed into a corner, holding a broken bottle and waiting for the first guy to swing. And he was forcing the most pristine, aristocratic navy in the galaxy to hold the bottle with him. "Issue the orders," Briggs said softly. "All ships, break formation. Welcome to the dirt." The space surrounding the Coalition Academy transformed from a tactical battlefield into a chaotic, sprawling bar fight. Outside the shattered viewports of the command center, the void was choked with massive, expanding clouds of white, flash-frozen coolant gas. The Coalition heavy cruisers, stripping themselves of their safety protocols, vented their lines entirely. The gas created a massive thermal wall, blinding the alien sensors completely. "Cruiser Vanguard is in position," the COAM's officer reported, his voice tight with tension. "Reactor core temperature is climbing. They are hitting the red line. Hold them, Ford ordered, his eyes fixed on the holographic sphere. He was swaying on his feet. The medic had administered a second stim shot, but it was like throwing a glass of water onto a raging house fire. Ford's internal organs were failing. He was fighting on pure, stubborn malice. In the projection, 3 alien dreadnoughts, sleek and black, glided cautiously toward the expanding coolant cloud. They were searching for the prey that had suddenly vanished from their scopes. They moved in a tight, predatory wedge. "Wait," Ford whispered. The lead dreadnought breached the edge of the gas cloud. "Now!" Ford barked. "Fire everything!" Hidden deep within the freezing vapor, the Vanguard didn't use lasers. It didn't use sophisticated plasma torpedoes. It used raw, brutal kinetic force. The heavy railguns, powered by the energy previously reserved for the shields, fired heavy tungsten slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. At point-blank range, the alien armor didn't matter. The tungsten slugs hit the lead dreadnought with the force of a small moon. The impact didn't melt the hull. It shattered it. The black ship violently buckled in half, its spine snapping under the kinetic trauma. Debris and alien atmosphere vented violently into the void. "Target destroyed," the technician cheered. "Don't celebrate. Keep moving," Ford rasped, violently pointing at a cluster of alien frigates flanking the station. "They react to pain. They're going to swarm the Vanguard. Use it as bait." He was right. The moment the railguns fired, the thermal spike lit up the Vanguard on the alien sensors. The remaining dreadnoughts and a swarm of angular fighter craft immediately banked hard, diving into the vapor cloud to tear the crippled cruiser apart. "Tell the Vanguard to go dead. Cut the reactor," Ford ordered. "They'll be sitting ducks," Reed argued. "Cut the reactor," Ford yelled, coughing up a spatter of blood onto the glass. "They chase the heat," the comms officer relayed the order. The Vanguard powered down entirely, becoming a cold, dead chunk of metal drifting in the gas. The alien swarm, denied their thermal lock, blew right past it. "Now," Ford smiled, a terrible, bloody grin. "Spring the trap. Tell the destroyers hiding in the debris field to open up on their rear." From the shattered remains of the station's outer docking ring, 4 coalition destroyers powered up. They had been sitting in the wreckage of their own defensive perimeter, using the twisted metal of the station to mask their signatures. They ignited their sublight engines and tore out of the debris, coming up directly behind the alien swarm. It was a massacre. Without energy shields to protect them from rear assaults, the alien ships were gutted by the coalition's kinetic barrage. Tungsten rounds tore through thruster arrays, shattered command bridges, and detonated alien reactors. The void lit up with a dozen simultaneous, silent explosions, casting harsh shadows into the command center. For the next 20 minutes, the pristine coalition fleet fought like feral dogs. They used the wreckage of their own fallen ships as physical shields, hiding behind drifting husks to reload their railguns. They rammed alien frigates when their ammunition ran dry, using the superior mass of their heavy armor to crush the fragile, sleek hulls of the black ships. It was ugly. It was chaotic. It went against every tactical doctrine written in the Academy archives. And it was working. The alien armada, built for overwhelming first strikes and technological superiority, didn't know how to handle an enemy that fought with such suicidal, irrational violence. Their formations completely collapsed. The hunters had been dragged into the mud, and they were drowning in it. "Sir," the comms officer said, looking up from his screen, awe plain on his face. "The enemy flagship, It's breaking off. They're spooling up their jump drives. The entire vanguard is retreating. In the holographic projection, the remaining black ships ceased their attack runs. They pulled away from the station, violently accelerating toward the edge of the system gravity well. Space began to tear open as they initiated emergency slipspace jumps, fleeing the meat grinder they had walked into. "Let them run," Ford breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't have the strength to stand anymore. His legs buckled. Briggs caught him before he hit the floor. The immaculate instructor went down on one knee, easing the human cadet onto the cold metal deck of the command center. Around them, the room erupted into cheers. Technicians wept, hugging each other. Commander Reed slumped against the tactical table, burying his face in his hands, trembling with the sheer relief of survival. But down on the deck, it was quiet. Briggs looked at the medic. The medic scanned Ford with a handheld diagnostic tool. The device whined a high, steady pitch. The medic just shook his head, lowered the tool, and stepped back. There was nothing left to do. The radiation had destroyed Ford's nervous system. Ford stared up at the vaulted ceiling. His breath rattled in his chest, a shallow, wet sound. "Hey," Ford whispered, his eyes finding Briggs. "I'm here, Cadet," Briggs said. His voice, usually so sharp and commanding, was thick. "Sector 4, Ford forced the words out, fighting past the blood in his throat. It's not a dead zone." "I know," Briggs said quietly. "I brought the ship back." Ford's lips twitched into a faint, fading smile. "The Providence. She made it to the docking bay." "She made it. You navigated a critical failure. You secured the vessel." Did I pass the practical?" Briggs felt a tightness in his throat that he hadn't felt in 30 years. He looked down at the kid from the dirt, the kid they had tried to throw away, the kid who had just saved billions of lives by refusing to die quietly. Briggs reached up and unpinned the silver command insignia from his own ruined collar. He leaned down and pressed the heavy metal pin into Ford's trembling hand, closing the human's fingers over it. "With honors, Commander," Briggs said softly. "You passed with honors." Ford looked at his hand. The tension slowly bled out of his jaw. The frantic, stubborn light in his eyes dulled, and then, slowly, faded entirely. He let out one last long breath, and the command center faded to black. The aftermath of the battle was a brutal, silent accounting. The orbital station was crippled, burning in a dozen places, held together by emergency bulkheads and failing structural integrity fields. Outside, the void was a graveyard. The debris of the Coalition defense fleet mingled with the shattered, light-absorbing hulls of the alien invaders. In the command center, the cheers had long since died down. The reality of the cost had settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Commander Reed stood by the viewport, staring out at the wreckage. His pristine view of the galaxy was gone. The clean, orderly universe he had taught in the lecture halls had been ripped apart, replaced by a jagged, chaotic reality. Briggs stood beside the tactical table. They had placed a clean white sheet over Ford's body. The human looked so small underneath it. The heavy, unyielding gravity of the room seemed to pull entirely toward that single, still form. "We have to classify this," Reed said quietly, turning his back on the window. "The public cannot know how close we came to annihilation. We will say it was a localized pirate incursion, a structural failure in Bay 4. Briggs looked at Reed. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. "Pirates," Briggs spat. "You want to sweep this under the rug? You want to go back to pretending we are untouchable?" "I want to prevent a galactic panic," Reed shot back. "Look at what they did to us, Briggs. They tore through our best ships in minutes. If that human hadn't—" Reed swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. "If that human hadn't dragged them into the light, we would be ash," Briggs finished for him. "He fought them with a scrap heap, a wrench, and the stubborn refusal to lay down and die. He showed us how to survive. He showed us that our pristine doctrines are useless against the monsters in the dark." Briggs reached down and pulled the blood-stained datapad from the console. "There is no classifying this, Commander. I am uploading this telemetry to the High Council, unencrypted, along with the tactical recordings of this battle. They are going to see exactly how a kid from Earth commanded the Coalition fleet to victory." "They'll strip you of your rank," Reed warned. "Let them," Briggs said. He turned and looked down at the white sheet. "We spent decades looking down on humanity. We thought they were brute labor, unrefined, undisciplined. We gave him a broken ship because we thought he belonged in the trash." Briggs squared his shoulders. "We were fools. The galaxy is a dark, brutal place, and we desperately need people who know how to fight in the dark. Humanity isn't our bottom tier, Reed. They are our vanguard. And I will make damn sure the entire Coalition knows the name of the man who proved it." Briggs walked out of the command center, leaving Reed alone with the silence, the wreckage, and the legacy of Cadet Caleb Ford. The Providence was dead, but the spark it had carried back from the edge of the galaxy had ignited a fire that would burn across the stars. Cadet Ford paid the ultimate price, but he didn't just save the Coalition. He shattered their arrogance and proved that when the galaxy needs saving, you don't send a polished aristocrat. You send a human with a wrench and nothing to lose. Did Ford's sacrifice hit you right in the feels? How do you think the Coalition will treat Earth now that a human taught them how to actually win a war? Smash that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another HFY epic.